was a little bit short notice. It's still fun. My name is Petteri Nakamura. I work for DNV Cyber. I also, while working, well, let's start a little bit. So, work for DNV Cyber. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to what DNV Cyber is a little bit later. I work as a cybersecurity management consultant. Earlier, I have a pretty technical background, but I have been slowly moving into these more management positions, and now I've been trying my hand on consulting for almost 2 years. While working, I also study at the Turku University. I'm doing a second master's in social sciences, focusing on East Asia, and specifically, or more specifically on China. So my first master's was in cybersecurity, and now I'm combining the social science studies with cybersecurity. So my topic today is trust in your supply chain in the era of de-risking. And that's trust in your supply chains, not a suggestion to trust them, but actually more the opposite, actually. How can we trust them in this geopolitical climate that we are in? So this is based on what I'm writing my thesis on. I'm kind of combining these geopolitics and social sciences, cybersecurity, and also talking about supply chains. But what is DNV Cyber? People might know Nixu better. So I studied at Nixu almost 2 years ago now, but Nixu was bought. Actually, they were in the process of being bought by DNV, which is a Norwegian global assurance and risk management provider. About 160 years old, actually 161 years old company. Now, this year, Nixu is a little bit younger, established in 1988, if I remember correctly. I would say a fairly known player in cybersecurity here in Finland. And then you have also a couple of other companies, Applied Risk, OT Cybersecurity, and CyberOwl, which is very basically maritime cybersecurity, maritime vessels. And together, we have combined to DNV Cyber. We have about 500 people all around Europe, Nixu being actually about 2/3 of DNV Cyber. So I would say we are still, at least in Finland, very much Nixu. But elsewhere, DNV might be more familiar. Looking at these drivers for cybersecurity, why do we need cybersecurity? There are quite a lot, but we have raised, for example, digitalization of society, rise in cybercrime, and so forth. Basically, IBM found earlier that cyber attacks in Europe grew about 31% within 1 year between 2023 and 2024. So we are very much on this kind of rising curve of cyber attacks. That's one driver. And then my favorite topic being geopolitics and polycrisis. So we have climate crisis, economic downturn, sanctions, trade restrictions, tariffs. Anybody seen in the news lately? And what I want to do here, and also in my thesis, is to kind of focus on these bigger drivers, bigger picture. Why are things the way they are? They also affect us when we work on cybersecurity. And also, my focus is very much on well, EU, US, China, the big kind of players in this. And all of us, basically in these different regions, we all have our traumas that have created us or made us the way we are. And countries are very much the same. And I'm also a history buff, so I like to start with historical figures. I was thinking that maybe Lenin might wake people up after a couple of corporate slides. There I really like this saying that has been attributed to Lenin, probably misattributed. There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. At least when looking at the news lately, I very much feel like that. It's probably a perception, or because when we look at history, we see all kinds of stuff happening all the time. But Lenin, he definitely lived in such a time. You know, if you remember history, he was basically living in this second industrial revolution, the first one being something that has very much affected everything that we have nowadays. The world was completely different 100 years ago than what it is now. We have, well, they had wars, we have wars now. We have pollution. Actually, they had pollution too. The London Times predicted in 1894 that in 50 years' time, every street in London would be buried 9 feet under horse manure. So they had that kind of problem. But of course, things have developed since. There has been a couple of world wars, industrial revolution kind of kicked on these big changes that have led into what we now have, these global supply chains. So of course, 100 years ago, the production was a lot more localized. When you think of it, now we are very much connected to everyone, and what happens in the US, for example, affects us right away. But we could see certain things happening. So, for example, these economic dependencies grew. We saw jobs from so-called developed countries move to these less developed countries, developing countries, manufacturing moving to cheap ones. And I think one thing that we have been doing over the last, I don't know how many decades, is kind of this optimizing our supply chains, right? So it makes sense that different regions in the world focus on different things. So for example, in developed countries, you would, if you have an iPhone in your pocket, that would be designed in the US, right? Then the ore for its different components would be dug up in Congo, Chile, Australia. The components with themselves would be manufactured in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, so forth. Then they would be assembled in China, Foxconn, so forth. Apple has big factories in China nowadays. Then they would be shipped from there to all around the world and sold worldwide. But that, when you think of it, when we think of the history in there, those developed countries, for example, China, used to have this idea that China is the factory of the world, right? And it's these more value-added things would happen in the West, while these assembly, these more simple things, happen in these less developed countries like China. But the thing with that is that these less developed countries, developing countries, usually become developed countries themselves, unless there are some other problems with them. I went recently to this really interesting museum here in Finland, Tampere, in Turku, but don't be wrong for talking about Tampere here. It's the history in Tampere is really interesting because it is about this industrialization in Finland. So after our wars, our economy grew really quickly while we were rebuilding, and we were paying those war reparations to the Soviet Union. And industry creates supply, and supply creates demand, and that's how we kind of moved from these simple products to more complex ones and more added products. We basically climbed this value chain, and that's what different countries in East Asia have already been doing. When we look at these different areas after the Second World War, during the wars, US used to be this armory of the free world. That's what they called it. And after the world, they basically just changed their economy. They had everything still in place. They hadn't been bombed to bulk like all of Europe, most of China, and so forth. So the US got a kind of a head start after the wars. In East Asia, or well, in Europe, we also rebuilt. There was US support involved, the Marshall Plan, and in East Asia there were these tiger economies that did the same really fast. And China was a little bit how do you say? Well, they took a little bit more time to start it because of the Mao era, Cultural Revolution, and so forth. But they got there, and they have been doing the same. So looking a little bit at this history, so US, and now fast forwarding quite a lot. So in the around 1990s, around when it was established, and I think quite a few in this room who were born around this time or a little bit earlier. That's also when internet became a really big thing. So we all grew up with the internet. The thing with the internet is that it, the beginning kind of followed this US worldview. So you had open, not regulated internet, free market innovation. We very quickly had browsers. We had the World Wide Web. And then, of course, there was the dot-com bubble that burst. In the EU, we were more focused on integration, economic integration. So we had the EU. Finland joined the EU in 1995, and it was expanding. Focus on unifying the markets, and our trauma basically being these European empires fighting with each other all the time. So one thing that we often say is that was behind the EU was never again to have these wars. Right? That's the key driver there. When China, around this time, they had already emerged from those Mao years. They had a setback after the Tiananmen incident, but then they were able to kind of restart that reform and opening up. And they got their first internet connection in 1994, after which they very much started to focus on also on how to control the internet. So from the very beginning, there's this doctrine about how unrestricted warfare. Already in the 90s, these military theorists in China were talking about viruses and how to use those, how China could use those to beat a militarily more advanced opponent, such as the United States. Because China's kind of this trauma is about foreigners colonizing. They had this these opium wars before Mao and before the world wars. So their vision of the internet was actually completely different from the US vision. There's an interesting thing that Bill Clinton said at some point. He said that China trying to control the internet is like trying to nail Jello to the wall. It will always drop. China built their Great Firewall, censorship, and so forth. So they basically said, "Hold my beer, I'll show you how I nail the Jello to the wall." They were also climbing the value-added ladder. They joined the World Trade Organization, and around 2008, they kicked the foreign, mainly US services, internet services, out of the country, which opened their market basically so that they could build their own internet companies. So interestingly, we now have, if during the Cold War, we had two different spheres. We had this Western kind of ecosystem, technical ecosystem, and then we had the Soviet ecosystem, which were completely kind of separated. China was doing, or started doing, the same thing already quite early when they got their internet, when they connected to the internet. So they started preparing for creating this kind of isolation for themselves to protect themselves from Western influence in the internet. In the US, 9/11 happened. That's a really big trauma for Americans, I believe. That's kind of a key event where a lot of stuff that we are often talking about today started. So they created their Patriot Act. That's where the NSA surveillance program started. And they came to light in 2010, Snowden revelations. That was a really big kind of a thing that dented this US image, I would say. And it was really interesting. I've read these about how Google basically left China because China, Google left China because Chinese hacked them. Right? They didn't want to do the censorship that China required anymore. So they basically said that, okay, we will not filter our searches anymore, trying to kick them out, and they focused on the Western markets. And then a lot of these technology companies in the US found out that NSA was actually tapping into their traffic and their data without their knowledge. I forgot who it was, but there's this quote that I read in a book of this US tech executive who said that his view of the United States government is the same as his view of the People's Liberation Army in China, is an adversary I need to keep out of my networks. So this is an interesting kind of setup. Well, that of course in the EU led into a lot of talk about privacy, GDPR. That's pretty much a direct result of these Snowden revelations. That stuff also didn't escape China. They noticed it too. And now, at this time, Xi Jinping was in power. He had started to, again, focus on kind of consolidating power, focusing on national security, and of course, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity in China is actually their idea of what cybersecurity is a little bit different from ours. So, for example, that Great Firewall, that is a cybersecurity measure in China. So they protect this Chinese internet from harmful influence. And also,
it's justified.
Okay.
That's a smart way to justify things.
Oh, it is
security reasons.
It is security, and basically because the kind of real focus is on regime security and this societal harmony. You need to be able to control.
The EU is trying to go the same way as China with the China control.
Yeah. Let's see. That's the interesting thing there is that where we come from is completely different. I do know this these discussions about these weakening encryption, reading those messages. Of course, I think that has this influence from these NSA surveillance programs, right? There's the same idea. We need to be able to read those messages so that we can be able to see if something bad is going to happen. That's the reason China is basically reading everyone's messages already. And in the EU so far, we have usually said that, well, we can see these different examples around the world. Do we want to have that here? I have a little comparison of these different areas, basically China, US, Europe. I think that's a place where we can talk about that a little bit more. That's an interesting part. But looking at these Chinese measures that they have been doing after 9/11, there's a lot of stuff. They have recently created a lot of laws around cybersecurity. It's interesting how the personal information protection law of China, I read the whole thing, and I thought that it's pretty much a copy of GDPR. They have changed certain parts, and made it a little bit less, a little bit vaguer, the way Chinese law is usually written, but it's very much a copy of GDPR. It's very interesting. Please.
I have a funny anecdote about the effects of the kind of changes what they made after the cyberspace administration.
Okay.
So if any of you remember when World of Warcraft launched, that was a while back, right?
Yeah.
So it actually initially launched on a beta in China.
Oh.
So you had quite a lot of go-ahead time before the go-live in the Western world that came down with the beta. But at that time, all of the metro information about people actually traveling in the metro, the social security numbers were open for search. And in order to get into the World of Warcraft beta in China, you had to have a social security number of a Chinese natural person.
Yeah, sounds about right.
So back then, we would have even the social security numbers were completely valid if you had been using metro at that point before.
Yeah, and if you look at this cybersecurity in China, it's like I said, it's more concerned about this regime security than privacy of people. And basically, all the data is they need the data to be able to follow the people because they might start creating trouble, and the state needs to control the people. That's the way the idea goes. They have started focusing on privacy and cybersecurity lately because cybercrime is a major problem in China too. But it's interesting how those things are coming after. And also, of course, in China, the way they understand law is different than here. So they create laws, but in here we talk of rule by law, which basically means that a state creates laws, and those laws then control the state or govern the state. So the state cannot break those laws. But in China, we call it rule by law. So law is a tool for the state or the party state. And in any case, the Communist Party is above the law. So their own rules, the way they govern themselves is always above the law.
But is the privacy regulation here also like sort of against the data economy and the local one, where they might have like local companies collecting private information? So
Yeah.
For business purposes.
Yeah.
And
There
this
is.
kind of thing. Like where's the like alternatives to Facebook and others?
There are provisions about that, and that's pretty much also what the law says, that you shouldn't be collecting information that you don't need.
Have purpose.
But that's for the companies, right? That's for the companies. So the state is completely different. It's not for them.
But there's one big but here. That's an interesting topic. There was just a couple of days ago news about a big major scandal in China about the fact that a major corporation being very heavily sponsored by the CCP had its the daughter of a very famous executive was having an internet argument with
Yeah, I read
lots
that
of
too.
people on the forum, and all of a sudden, all of the people discussing against the daughter were doxxed. So
Yeah, I read that news too.
yeah,
And also, of course, there's a lot of corruption.
Yeah.
So they say that it's actually pretty easy to go online and buy someone else's personal information because, well, there are officials who will sell it to you.
I heard it's quite cheap.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Well, the global counter stations. So now, when you look at China now, they basically have a really strong position in those well, manufacturing. They're building electric cars, electric batteries. 90% of the processing of rare earth minerals happens in China now. So they have really come a long way from those Mao days, right? Which is, of course, something that the US views as a threat. Right? So foreign policy objective for the US for a long time has basically been to kind of contain China. Of course, if you think about it, we had this unipolar moment. I think most of the people in this room grew up during that time when the United States was this sole pole of power in the world. So they were the military power. They through the internet they had really strong soft power all around the world and so forth. And now we are basically moving into this multipolar era. And if you look at what Trump is doing, it seems to me that he's accelerating that. And in the in the EU, we are now talking about strategic autonomy. We have been very much aligned with the US for a long time, and we are basically in the middle of these two giants, basically. But I think in the EU, we often think of ourselves not as a kind of a world power. So I think we should, because EU has also been called a regulatory superpower. Of course, a lot of what the EU does, it does through regulation. Of course, those chat regulations that have been discussed lately, those are part of that too. That is the EU way. Not everyone is happy about that. Right? I think it's a really good question. Are we regulating ourselves to death? And are we focusing on wrong things? While the US and China are putting all their resources in AI, we are talking about photo caps. It's an interesting question. I don't really have an answer, but thinking about how these different regions think, regulation is something that EU is very strong. It's something that I believe that something that it has really big influence outside the EU too. So, for example, China copying EU laws. GDPR was very much created to counter this US collection of personal data in the EU. US basically responded to that by creating the Cloud Act, saying that, well, if it's a US company, we have the right to ask them for information, for data, regardless of where that is. So that is basically trying to undermine the EU law. And let's see where these Trump tariffs and all this talk leads, because now we also have this new legislation in the EU to kind of try to handle the social media companies. They are a big problem nowadays too.
But the GDPR is actually quite a good example in this. You being kind of regulatory superpower, it's actually, there's a term for that. It's called Brussels effect. So
yes, exactly.
It was Anu Bradshaw who was that, who brought that term in public. So, but yes, for example, China has now kind of GDPR law, but there are actually about 100 countries in the world who have acquired quite the same kind of legislation than GDPR.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite a good example that the regulatory power can be something. Okay, it's hard way, but okay, we might be there, have an edge there still.
Yeah, I have a Chinese friend who just recently told me of this Chinese company that was it was about a Chinese company who was telling its people not to do too much overtime. And the reason was the EU laws on forced labor. So they were afraid of getting somehow banned from EU markets for forced labor if their people work too much in China. So that is also Brussels effect. Well, this is just a picture to kind of show this kind of dependency. So even though when horse poo was the major pollution problem back then, it didn't really matter if something happened across the world. Your local production still worked. But nowadays, we have these global supply chains, and different countries have also started weaponizing them. So Russia is a kind of good example. We started to, when Russia attacked Ukraine, we started to talk about stopping using Russian gas, natural gas, and energy, and Russia was basically trying to use that also as a kind of a clutch to against the EU, although they were also very much dependent on the money that they were getting from the EU. China has used those supply chains to pressure foreign companies and airlines, for example. When at some point they started saying that, well, anyone who insinuates that Taiwan is a country, they won't let those airlines fly to China, right? So either you mark Taiwan as a province of China or you don't fly into China. There was also this incident when Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius. China suddenly, basically, products coming from Lithuania couldn't be cleared in customs in China. It was just some computer bug, I'm told. They just didn't work anymore. And they also started pressuring foreign companies not to do business with Lithuania. That thing was escalated to the EU level. That's only when it helped against this Chinese portion. United States, they also have used sanctions to stop technology from US, or these technology that has US components being sold to China or other countries. That has hit, for example, ASML, the Dutch company that creates these really advanced lithography machines that can make most advanced chips. So that is also kind of extraterritoriality there. And also Snowden, in his book, made claims that US has set up kill switches in Europe, in our critical infrastructure and so forth, with the access that they have had in here. And lately we have those discussions about kill switches in F-35s. Very much seems to be that we're in these different places, but all this influence happens around. Then lately, you just need to open the news and you'll see more examples. Tariffs for China. I lost track of what they were. They, of course, Trump backed off with most tariffs, except for China, after the US government wanted it.
Tariffs for penguins are still 10%.
Yeah. And now Beijing is warning countries against colluding with US on trade against China. So they are responding. It's really interesting to see where this all goes. Then I think I'm talking for quite a while already, but this is the comparison I promised. So when we talk about these areas, of course, these are huge areas. We're talking about 3 billion people. In China, they have 1.2 to 1.4 billion people, depending on who you ask. How many do we have in Europe? 400. So 400 million, 500 million, about the same in the US. And of course, they are, because these are huge areas, we have cultural differences between countries in Europe. So there are cultural differences between areas in China and also in the US. But the big picture, we have certain differences in the political system. U.S., European Union. Well, U.S. is a liberal democracy with a federal structure, also politically very heavily divided. European Union is not a country; it's a union of democratic states, and China is a Leninist one-party state. Role of law that I mentioned earlier. So we have rule of law in the United States. It's interesting to see how their rule of law is lately being kind of challenged. In China, as I said, rule by law. So you have this CCP policies will always go above the law. Freedom of expression, China is restricted. There's institutionalized censorship and propaganda. It's protected in European Union. But we have interesting differences between the United States and Europe, basically. So in the US, they have this very absolutist view of freedom of speech. You can go and see the speech by Dave Vance he gave in Europe some time ago. That was a really interesting example of trying to apply that in Europe, because in here, freedom of speech does not really cover hate speech. That's a really big kind of issue between Europe and the United States. Government and companies and their relationships. So in the United States, you have this certain kind of, while they are independent, but influenced on national security grounds, and they have really strong influence over the state also. In European Union, they are regulated quite heavily, but still, I would say that in here, this rule of law is really strong. This is really the key thing, or key difference between, say, with China. So if we argue that, well, basically, if China says that, well, we will decrypt anything that you write, and EU wants to decrypt, they come from a little bit different place. But of course, our trauma again is that we have seen where this kind of monitoring takes us. So we have experience with these fascist governments and so forth. So not very many people are excited to see something like that emerging. Role of the state in tech, there are differences. How, for example, in the United States, very low regulation. In China, full political control. And in Europe, it's regulatory driver. Like, the regulatory superpower. Internet governance model goes to view on data. This is in the United States, I would call it a commodity for the companies. In Europe, they focus on privacy and citizens' rights in there, and in China, commodity state resource. It's very much a state resource, and a lot of those laws also kind of prohibit sending data outside of the country, or it's restricted rather. Cybersecurity focus, and then supply chains and how they work. And what I'm in my thesis, what I want to kind of study, I don't have answers yet, but this is a rudimentary kind of thing to identify certain things that we should be focusing when we try to determine if we can trust our supply chains. So there are very different things that I don't think we have been thinking about before. But for example, NIS2, DORA, CRA, those new laws, they basically require us to look at this. And in that sense, I think this regulation is again a very welcome thing. Don't agree with them on the that's all I have from Lenin to supply chains. Any questions, comments, please?
Yeah. Have you had the luck or ill fortune of actually having software supply chain management?
Maybe fortunately.
You're lucky, no?
So I guess question like a few years back we had like all the supply chains almost in the world broke sort of due to COVID manufacturing crisis and I guess like before that we had only been focusing on like supply chain optimization and not robustness. Is that something like the people are now maybe more prepared for these kind of disruptions, or is it like gonna repeat all over again if we get some type of disruption like that? And is it like people building more inventories right now, or like how the landscape has changed, if it has changed?
I don't have answers to those questions. But I know that there is a lot more focus on it. So I think COVID-19 was a wake-up call. There's also a lot of other stuff that happened at that time. But also, I think there was drought in East Asia, and that's why we didn't have chips at some point. So no hard drives. That was a big problem at some point. I think it was a wake-up call. And if you look at how Western companies, for example, in China, because China continued its really harsh policies for a very long time. It ended after the so-called white paper protests. So people starting to really protest against those policies. They just suddenly disappeared. So it was really interesting to watch back then, because it was like every indication that they're going to continue it forever. Then suddenly they just said that, well, now everything is okay. Now we don't need them anymore. And they were expecting the global tourism and all the investments and a business travel to just return right away. But it hasn't. And many companies, when you read the news and research on this, many companies are saying that they are actually moving their manufacturing out of China or diversifying. Companies are moving their head offices, Asian head offices out of China. I have numbers on those somewhere also. So, and that's something that the European Chamber of Commerce in China has looked into. They have gone and asked what the plans of these different companies in China are. Many say that, well, we need to diversify. And it's interesting that even Chinese companies are doing the same. So China kind of lost trust back then. Now, the latest news on US, I just read Finnish news about how tourism into US has really gone down from Europe because of those tariffs. And people basically saying that, well, I don't know if they'll detain on the border. So of course these things affect, and I know that there are business leaders who are in Finnish companies also thinking about these things. So it used to be optimization, now it's more about also thinking about how resilient your supply chains are. Oh, please.
Yeah, so you talked actually quite a bit about like you have the slide about the differences between like China, United States, and Europe. Like, yeah, like you have chosen like rights-based regulation, yeah, GDPR needs to. I mean, I don't know about needs to. It's more towards like isn't it more supposed to be like general resilience rather than just like. I mean, yeah, it's protecting the right to have like water and stuff like that. But like the thing that like you like the thing that like was for me that like you probably didn't bring that out was that like like that was really interesting to me because like you brought out like the TikTok and Huawei bans. like as far as I remember, in EU law, or at least in some level of law, you cannot apply like this, like regulation to a single company.
Yeah.
Like you must be like it must affect everyone equally.
Yep, that's true. That's a good point. I knew that I would go over time, so I didn't go into this topic too much, but it's really interesting. And if I remember right, in the U.S. law, they have specifically mentioned these companies, but that's not something that we do in the EU. The way it's formulated here is that you have to make risk-based risk assessments and make sure that you don't have these risks, right? And they can apply, and often actually do apply to U.S. companies as well. The Digital Markets Act, for example, I would argue that that's very much directed at U.S. social media companies, but it does hit, for example, TikTok too. Huawei, you know, in Finland, we don't have a Huawei ban, but the law in Finland basically says that the government can kind of identify these, if I remember right, they can identify risky vendors. Then the telecommunication companies have to respect that.
Last question.
Okay.
The question about the resilience of the supply chain. And maybe two naive statements, but what we've seen so far in the last 3 years is that when, let's say, when Europe is focused on doing something that can achieve it, so only 2 or 3 countries that really depend on Russian gas right now, because they're being stubborn. But like we've seen recently as well the issue with the CD database that was accidentally funded by the United States government, and everyone was like, okay, it's literally the XKCD of the one person from the master, and like there's a different structure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like we don't, like the way I see it, there's a lot of inaction from the EU to try to make it more robust so that we are not so dependent. Okay, we have a NIS tool that might try to fix that, but they're like, okay, this is not going to happen in the next 15 years, we're preparing for it. But like if they really wanted to, they could just say, okay, like you, for example, in the vulnerability database, okay, the US has defunded mid-trade. Okay, from now on, let's move on to the European database. It has a public beta. Let's move to it. Everyone, let's move to it. Let's fund it so it becomes like our own vulnerability tracking field, so that we don't have to depend on the US.
Yeah.
And also, like all of these tariff war and everything is just showing that, like, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of inaction, and in the end, like, those are supply chains, like, really can they support this? Because I mean, we depend on the US and China. Now, what this is doing to us is making us move closer to China because the US cannot be trusted. But we also know that China cannot be trusted as well. So.
Yeah, it is a dilemma. I think NIS 2 actually has stuff about the CVE database, if I remember right. I think there are plans, if not already a project in the EU building a database.
There is.
Yeah.
Yes.
China has one. Surprise, surprise! They after Snowden, they built their own, and they also told Chinese cybersecurity engineers and experts not to go, basically prohibiting them from joining these competitions abroad. They say that any company in China or anyone in China who finds a vulnerability, they have to report it to the Chinese government, and they collect them. And they say that they are those vulnerabilities are state assets. I actually have given a talk earlier, and it's really interesting how, for example, there was this leak of a Chinese cybersecurity company that was hacking other countries, and in their messages, in their internal messages, about how they receive vulnerabilities information from the Chinese government, how the Chinese government gives that out to different actors. So that is an interesting point. So, thank you.